Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Carter, Digital Health and East Coast Practice at Real Chemistry, and welcome to what promises to be a very exciting and very relevant panel discussion. Today, we're talking about healthcare innovation in Boston. More and more, Boston and Massachusetts as a whole has become the epicenter for healthcare innovation across so many areas, such as biotech, digital health, and life sciences. And our distinguished panel are leaders and innovators in these respective areas. One housekeeping item is that we will not be taking questions at the end in order to keep on schedule with the happenings at the health conference, but we encourage you to drop comments into the chat section if you wish. Now, allow me to introduce you to our moderator, Allison D'angelis, who is a senior healthcare reporter for Business Insider. Allison, welcome and thank you for leading today's discussion. And now let me turn over to you to get us started.
Thanks, Dan. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon, and so glad to have you here at the health panel with us and have you here in Boston. As Dan mentioned, my name is Allison D'angelis. I'm a senior healthcare reporter for Business Insider, and I've been in the Boston area for the last several years covering life sciences and biotech. So really glad to be digging into this panel with these wonderful panelists. Let me introduce them. We have Jeff Kosowsky, General Manager of Strategic Solutions and Corporate Development at Amwell, Amy Kramer, Senior Director of Global Biotech Ecosystem Development at Thermo Fisher Scientific, and Armon Sharei, Chief Executive Officer and Founder of Squeeze Biotech. Hello, thank you guys all for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
So my first question is kind of coming off of the notion that when most people think of Boston and the Boston healthcare ecosystem, some of the first things that usually come to their mind are the proximity to academic centers, Harvard, MIT, Northeastern, and the proximity to hospitals. And I wanted to point out and kind of dig into one thing that came up during our pre-call was, Armon, you came out of two of our top, universities. That's where you kind of started working on the idea of Squeeze. But then Jeff, you mentioned that, you also kind of came out of this academic ecosystem. But these days, a company like Amwell, you don't feel like you're getting as much, IP, as much new product development and new ideas from the academic centers here in town. So what's the disconnect there between, what biotech and what health tech is being offered from our local universities? Armon, I'm going to start with you, and then Jeff, I would love if you would join in.
Yeah, I think on the biotech side, the universities have been really great about fostering a lot of that innovation. For the PhD students and postdocs, I was at MIT for my PhD, and then I did my postdoc at Harvard. There's definitely also an atmosphere of people being very conscientious of trying to work towards translation, be it in the context of companies or in the academic setting, eventually translating these therapies to patients. And I think that kind of atmosphere and mindset is very much there. And I think that's what kind of helps beget more and more people like that, because a lot of times when people are trying to think about which school to go to or which lab to join, they start to consider that. So it kind of has this self-reinforcing element. So one of my professors, Bob Langer, like his lab is kind of really famous at this point for all the innovations that can come out of it. And then it has its own draw where a lot of people that are applying to grad school from around the world or applying for postdocs from around the world, they will gravitate towards these labs because they want to go in there. So I think that has a really nice self-reinforcing element that then feeds the startup environment, et cetera, and that really helps. And for health tech, which is a little further afield, and I'll definitely let Jeff comment on that, it may not have that level of self-reinforcing elements working in its favor yet, and maybe it just needs to get pushed a little further, but it's a little out of my zone. So I think Jeff would definitely know more.
Well, actually, quickly, I want to follow up, Armon. How much do you think that is influenced by the fact that you had somebody like a Bob Langer, that we have those people that are installed in local universities who have labs, and I would assume are kind of encouraging their students to consider innovation?
I think there's definitely a mix of kind of the environment encourages it, and then there's key individuals. So like I was really fortunate with my professors like Bob Langer and Klaus Jensen and Uli von Andrian, who was my postdoc advisor. These are all people that had been engaged in the more biotech and startup ecosystem. So they would naturally have a draw for students that wanted to do that and had like the initial connections and mindset to help make that happen. And if you don't have those individuals, then it makes it harder, because if you're in a lab who isn't as plugged in, it may be more alien what's going on, but at least you're still in the same ecosystem. So even though your lab isn't like that, if you're only a building away from someone's lab who is, or only down the hall from someone's lab who is, you'll still be exposed to it to an extent, or there'll be events at the school where you'll have the VCs or former students that are now in biotech, et cetera, coming in. These things all really help. So I think it's definitely a mix of the two, and one reinforces the other, which has been a nice system.
Yeah, Jeff, how did your experience and your experiences, I mean, in the last decade, let's say at Amwell, what have your interactions with academia been like?
Yeah, so let me also start with where you just left off, which is, I think there is something about timing before we get to the Amwell situation. I too trained in this area, did my MD, PhD at Harvard. I was the only student who was not really in the biosciences. I did my PhD in applied math, and it was a bit of an isolating experience there, but some of it was that really biotech, as Arno mentioned, was much more established there. So I think some of it is the history of it. Even Harvard as a university only instituted their formal department of bioinformatics several years ago, whereas obviously the biochemistry areas go back further. So some of it is that. But I don't think we can all lay it at that. I think there's also some cultural differences in terms of how some of the academic institutions work here. Some of the Amwell partners that we have in other parts of the company are more centrally run as hospitals and academic institutions. So they set agendas in terms of what they want to do in digital health and in other areas. In my perspective, I think there's still a lot more independence among departments. But from an Amwell perspective, it's very interesting. We're here in the Boston area. We're an innovator, obviously, in digital health. And I would say there's probably, and there's plenty of innovation going on in the hospitals, but I think there's fewer partnerships between hospitals and industry, and certainly something I'm passionate about and would love to change and progress. I'm sure there are many, many factors there. I don't want to speculate on all of them, but there's still probably a little bit of positive jealousy in my mind when I see how many amazing companies are spawned that have come out of labs, as Arnon has done, that I think we've had less of that in the health tech area. It's obviously a huge opportunity given the number of technology companies we have here and the incredible universities, as well as the incredible hospitals to trial some of this technology. And I don't want to overstate the point. Certainly we work with health systems, and one of our board members is the CEO of Mass General. So there's plenty of connections. I don't think we've optimized it or created the same type of deep currents of connection that has happened in the biotech industry.
Interesting. Yeah, Amy, I want to bring you in here. Your role at Thermo Fisher has evolved in the last couple of years, and Thermo Fisher in 2019 established this big partnership with MIT, with Lab Central, one of our, big incubators and accelerators here for the biotech industry. I'm curious, what kind of made you guys reestablish and recreate what you were doing within the last year or two, and establish this partnership with MIT that hadn't existed before?
Sure. We see obviously within the biotech industry, it's growing leaps and bounds, and these young, new emerging biotechs, the young entrepreneurs, they need that ecosystem within a facility like a Lab Central or a biolabs, because, all of the resources and networking and, access to venture capital, access to technology. When we can partner with them, we're trying to enable them. So by getting our technologies in there, our services in there, to really help them thrive, to help them kind of move with speed. We know these young entrepreneurs, a lot of time they're first-time entrepreneurs, so they don't know what they don't know, and they really need as much support as possible. So, we see by partnering with these incubators like a Lab Central or Biolabs and others, we can really help them at their earliest stages from their very, foundation, and kind of help them as we understand their science and where they're trying to get to, be there helping them way ahead of time so they can really be able to accelerate their science as quickly as possible and get to that next milestone.
And these companies are also, your customers at the end of the day. What kind of new IP, new, product development is coming out of your work with some of these new startups and these young companies?
Yeah, absolutely. We do get IP from some of these biotechs as well as academia. We have lots of collaborations, whether it's in the Boston, Cambridge area, certainly, worldwide, where we're collaborating in academia, we're collaborating with these biotech, looking for new, novel, disruptive technologies or areas where we may have gaps, right? And they can help us. We, obviously a mutually beneficial relationship. So we, that's another advantage of working closely with incubators or just working directly with the biotechs from more of a scientific collaboration perspective, because we can really help each other advance science and at the end of the day, help the patients more quickly.
Jeff, I want to jump back to your comment about the work that Amwell is doing with hospital systems and the work that you have done, because one of the things that has come up quite a bit in the biotech world and in larger life sciences during the pandemic has been running clinical trials. And this concept that a lot of people, when hospitals started shutting down non-essential procedures, had to forego, had to pause clinical trials and had to rethink the way that they did them. And we've seen adoption of new technology. From your perspective, how, we're still in COVID, but like at this point in time, how beneficial is it, or not at all, to have a close proximity to major medical centers and have these partnerships with them when we are in a time of kind of adopting more virtual tools?
Yeah, so certainly we, and I'm sure we'll get to more of this later in the conversation, we do eat our own dog food. We're a virtual health company. It's all about how do you bring traditional healthcare using with your traditional healthcare providers and stakeholders, but how do you have it in a different place, your home, sometimes your office, your car, wherever it is. So certainly much of what we do is really about virtualizing elements of care. You talk about clinical trials. It's another area that we've worked on, whether very publicly with Apple and the Apple Heart Study, or in our work with a number of different pharma companies. I think what we see it, and I'm not sure, maybe take your question to the next level, is really all elements or many elements of patient, doctor, medical, pharma, medical biotech, medical health tech can really be virtualized and become much more patient-centric, and the actual boundaries of care don't matter as much. Spent a fair bit of time the last couple of years starting up a partnership, joint venture with Cleveland Clinic, where we do second opinions and other very and beyond complex delivery of care, across not just county boundaries or state boundaries, but across international boundaries. And I think what we're going to see in general with this technology is the ability where the proximity becomes a lot less important. And as I said, we are really eating our own dog food. So when we have this type of meeting and you have problems with your cameras and or one's audio or any of those types of things, that goes really straight to our hearts and straight to our minds, because we have to realize that this is what, this is just one element as one virtualizes. But I think the trend is very, very clearly that for many, many reasons, it's to the patient's advantage. You get better outcomes, better economics, better efficiencies, if one can relax some of these geographical constraints that created, great centers like Boston, but also great deserts of care when one is not in a large city academic center.
Yeah. Armon, Amy, I want to loop you in. From the perspective of companies that are developing new therapies, how has the process of kind of adjusting how clinical trials have been run? Armon, I know you guys you're in those early critical stages. Yeah. For a young startup, had just IPO'd, or were in the process of getting an IPO off the ground when COVID hit. How have you guys adjusted?
Yeah, I think the trial side was definitely a big piece for us, because especially with us, because we do cell therapies, one element for the sites is that the more complicated the trial can be, the more prohibitive it could be for them to run these trials during the constraints of COVID. And I think for us, one thing that was very fortunate is that our cell therapies are much simpler and more practical ultimately than what the field has been used to. So the fact that with our cell therapies, we didn't need to hospitalize the patients afterwards, and our manufacturing times are very fast. It meant that we were luckily able to keep things going, even though other cell therapy trials were getting shut down, because, for example, the fact that the consequences of these other cell therapies led to hospitalization and they needed hospital beds at the time, that meant a lot of those trials would just get shut because of that issue. Whereas in our case, because we didn't necessitate it, we were able to keep things going, but adapting to it was tricky because we needed to find ways to make a lot of the elements of the trial as streamlined as possible so that it's minimizing complexity for the sites. We had sites across the country, and some areas of the country would be better at times, some areas would be worse at times. So we had to find ways to balance that. So it would definitely slow it down. And then on the team side, we did, I think, what many did, which was find the right balance of keeping the lab work going, because that's ultimately what's going to lead to those new therapies, and you can't really do the lab work from your room, or that wouldn't be safe. But for the other functions that led themselves to being virtual, doing that and just finding the best ways to adapt and keep things going. And I think everyone in the industry did feel that kind of crunch on trial dynamics and timing, which is starting to improve now that everyone's kind of figured things out a bit more.
Yeah, Amy, anything to add there? I mean, from the perspective of these young startups that you're interacting with, I mean, what their needs are with regard to clinical trials and trying to adapt to new technologies and new ways of running clinical trials.
Yeah, I'm probably not as well equipped to speak to it at this point, but we are, today we support clinical trials, absolutely, but you've seen in the news, right? We hope to close an acquisition with PPD, and that's their business. So I think our story will be very different after that acquisition closes, where, we'll be very involved in a global leader of running clinical trials, but just don't have the experience really in the past year with COVID to be able to speak to that as well.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of acquisitions, Boston, I mean, kind of given that you can, a stone's throw and you'll hit like 3 startups, has always kind of had this aura of, being a place where you can kind of hear about the best and brightest IP and potentially make some deals. And Jeff, I know that Amwell has been doing some M&A recently. How do you feel about the prospects for M&A for a health tech company like Amwell in the Boston area?
So it's interesting in terms of what does geography mean. So certainly the great companies here. We are, constantly in discussion of all types of relationships with companies here. If you'd asked me this question 2 years ago, I probably would have put it, and when we had conversations, proximity was a great thing because you thought about, we can consolidate headquarters or certain headcounts, or it made it easier culturally. I think one thing that COVID has taught us, by the fact that so many of our teams are virtual and we really are a work from home company, that maybe that's become less important. And I think that's across many factors have become a good thing. We've actually reduced our footprint, not just in our headquarters, but also in some of our acquired locations, because we can be more virtual. So I still love it. When you look at if 2 companies, if one is nearby, and that means you get to know them not just post an acquisition, but even beforehand, because they're neighboring and they're companies we continue to meet. It's great if it's local, if you can just get in an Uber or take the T. But I think I see it as much more upside, that geography has become less limiting, and one can really think about who are the best companies and less have to think about what that means for your geographical footprint.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. One thing that's been brought to my attention recently is that, we have quite a new dynamic emerging in health tech. We have this kind of bridging of, digital therapeutics, these tech tools that are being, approved by the FDA to actually have a benefit to patients. And that's potentially a very good step for, you know, a telehealth company like Amwell to kind of adopt some of those technologies. And we've got a couple of those companies right here in the Boston area. What do you think about a company like Amwell getting involved in digital therapeutics?
Yeah, so I've worked with a lot of different digital therapeutic companies, and it's certainly an important element. I would step back a second. It's really a fundamental question for a company like Amwell. Are we a platform company, or do we want to also own or have more control of the therapeutic? And in general, obviously, we do deliver care ourselves. We just purchased a CBT company, a cognitive behavioral therapy company, actually a local company, although they have Irish origins, but they're currently their leadership is out of Boston. But I do think so. Maybe it's broader than just M&A. From when talking about digital therapeutics, in many ways we're going to be better off being an open platform. There may be certain areas that we want to acquire or lead because of the connectivity. You want to connect to other elements of care, or maybe because there's not enough innovation, we think we can spur it there. But I think in general, where our goal is really a connector, it's not even just technology. We're about connecting patients and providers and innovators and consumer type companies. So I think we will be a stronger company by our ability to work with multiple therapeutic companies and really be more of a distribution platform for them, a connector platform, so that we can offer to our payer clients and our health system clients best of breed, versus, and there's some of our competitors that may be taking a more narrow line versus saying we're going to be just completely vertically integrated. But I think, so it's not just M&A, I say it's more partnership. So I really think that the real future, and again, and if when we're to ask the question, Boston versus the rest of the world, it's beyond M&A. It's really in terms of all the networks of partnerships and connectivity, reseller arrangements, whatever it is that is allowed for when one has that type of platform technology.
Yeah, it's funny. A lot of the conversation that we've been having so far has kind of been dancing around this topic of proximity, and that pre-pandemic proximity was everything, you know, and talking about your geographic distance was everything. And what's funny to note about this panel is that Amwell, which I think, Jeff, you had said you guys are entirely virtual now, is the only one who actually has a physical presence in Boston proper. Armon, you guys had just set up or were setting up your
in Watertown.
Yeah, right as the pandemic kind of hit. So in your mind, I mean, each of you, do you need to be in an ecosystem like Boston? Do you need to have a physical presence in the future, or is that something that COVID has kind of changed your perspective on?
I would say for us, absolutely. You know, we already have a huge footprint in Massachusetts. We are expanding right now within Plainsville, Chelmsford, and other areas, but we see it because it is such a thriving ecosystem, because there is so much happening right there, and there's so much continued capacity need and expansion needs within the cell therapy area, gene therapy area. So we see it as absolutely, you know, in our business, we can't do it virtually. We need to be out there in person and have a physical presence, whether it's warehousing that customers want with you know, close proximity, logistics and supply chain obviously being so critical right now. A lot of the customers are looking for that proximity. So, you know, we see it as extremely important.
Yeah, I agree. I think I think that proximity piece is not going to go away, because I think similar to what Amy was referring to, like there's this core element of the things like the lab work and other scientific work that has to be done at a location. So people still need to go back and forth to that. And so the problem people would really face is, do you have your non-lab functions live somewhere else in the ether or elsewhere, and then have your lab functions live here? And that I think would cause kind of a cultural disconnect within the company if there's kind of two tiers of people, one that goes in and does the work, and then the other tier that floats around on Zoom all day. And so I think ultimately it would resolve back towards location will continue to matter and being around the ecosystem. I think obviously some of the learnings of being able to do more virtual things will help connections, like we were talking about partnership stuff earlier, like it can make it more seamless to talk to many different partners, et cetera, or maybe recruit for certain functions from across the country or around the world in ways that people previously would have been more reluctant to do. But I think those core pieces of, you need a team that's going in to do the work, and from a cultural perspective, you want to have a presence with each other to some extent to really ensure that people are bound to kind of that bigger mission and each other. So I think those elements will, in the end, still dominate to ensure that you do want that physical presence in the ecosystem.
And maybe just to, oh, go ahead.
No, Amy, you jump in, then I'll follow up.
I was just going to say, you know, when you think about like just being physically with others, right, and networking and different events, and, you know, that's where a lot of the really creative discussions, the what if discussions, you know, kind of lead to that next discovery. And I know we're seeing right now with finally things beginning to open back up. And, you know, we've participated and hosted a couple events recently in Boston, Cambridge, and the turnout is enormous because people want and need, you know, to get away from the computers and have that social interaction and the ability to really be able to have so many much more productive conversations in a short time frame versus, you know, you miss all the nuances of these side conversations when you're on the computer on virtual calls. It's just, you know, now that we've started to get back out and attend events and meet with customers, you realize that, yeah, there were silver linings with all of the virtual world, but boy, it can't replace what can happen in person.
Yeah. Well, and there's also just, I mean, the proximity of kind of being close to some of these production facilities. I mean, you were mentioning, Amy, Plainville, I think you said Chelmsford as well. Armon, I was going to ask you, I mean, some of the physical tools that you guys use for your cell therapies, where are those manufactured?
So for us, there's different components to like ultimately what goes into making these cell therapies. So there's the chips that we use that the cells run through, and that's kind of a disposable. So those are actually manufactured by companies in Canada and Europe for what we do, and they get sent over here. Then there's the machines that are used to run the squeeze components. We have an engineering partner that's European that helps develop them, but they actually assemble them in Massachusetts. And then where this is all implemented is actually in New Hampshire for the cell therapy manufacturing. And a lot of this, when we're producing cell therapies for patients, like that gets flown in to the area, gets processed, then gets frozen and flown back out. But these are things that actually our long-term goal is to go towards a point of care implementation for our cell therapies. So having an integrated machine that can actually just sit at the hospital site and not need a clean room. So now you can have an operator at the hospital, put the patient's cells on it, run it through, and then have the product come off and administer it. So our goal in the long run is to decentralize that component, because for some of these things, like to the point on manufacturing, at least for cell therapies, the logistics of kind of sending everything back and forth can be prohibitive for certain applications. But if you can have it actually be produced at the hospital site, that can make all the difference in actually making these cell therapies accessible for a lot more patients and go into a lot more indications where right now they would have been impractical, but you can expand it to disease areas that now, if you can make it that practical, you can bring the power of cell therapies to those areas. Like autoimmune diseases are one thing that we've been expanding into for things like celiac and type 1 diabetes. And these are areas where it would be really hard to imagine a logistics network that could treat millions of patients by shipping it back and forth across the country.
Allison, maybe I just want to jump in a little bit about following up the previous question. So, I mean, I think we're in the middle of a really great experiment about what work from home means. We did a survey of our employees about what they wanted, and 80% said they wanted to be fully from home. We're facing a real war for talent in terms of hiring, particularly on the engineering side. Given how hot Boston is, from everybody requires coders and programmers and QA folks. So based upon that, we followed the survey. And so as mentioned before, we're pretty much 100% work from home. We went from plans pre-IPO of getting a new headquarters and expanding significantly into a new building to reducing our footprint in our existing building. I think it comes with their mixed parts. I personally, and maybe I come from the slightly older generation, I miss the interactivity. I miss the days when all my peers, our whole leadership team was all on one floor and we'd go in each other's offices. But right now, it's also opened up hiring. in that we have leadership from all over the country. We even have some international. We've had people who've moved out of Boston to other lower cost or maybe higher pleasure areas, whether Vermont or Maryland or whatever. So I think it's been a great employee benefit that way. You know, I'm sure the pendulum will swing back and forth, but I think the way we currently see it is to get the best of the Boston area in terms of the connectivity and the talent here, but we're also not limited by it. And I think we're all learning. We're learning how, and I think many of us, I'm sure even people who voted, the 80% who said they want fully from home, I'm sure there's always a part that misses, you know, the closer interactivity at work. But we're blessed by not having to have the lab, you know, the lab resources. We don't need physical proximity. And I think that's allowed us to be a little more aggressive in adapting to a virtual or work from home world.
Yeah, it's the hiring challenge in Boston it feels like one of the downsides of having this great ecosystem. And I mean, so much of what we've been talking about, we're not just talking about kind of straightforward needs of, you know, Squeeze needs a scientist, you know, Amwell needs an engineer. There are many different facets to your companies. And I can't even imagine all the roles that Thermo Fisher has for, you know, scientists, bioengineers. And to bring it back to a point from the beginning, I think that Jeff, you had mentioned that, you know, we've seen some of our academic centers like MIT adopt to new, you know, bioinformatics and these new facets of healthcare. And so I would want to close off with a question to all of you. How do you think that the Boston area is doing as a whole, adopting to the changes in healthcare and kind of the graying of some lines where it's, you know, Squeeze isn't necessarily a company that is fully, every person is a scientist. You have technology elements, you know, Amwell, you're a very new type of healthcare company. How is Boston doing adapting to that and embracing that change in what we kind of consider a healthcare company?
I can take first stab at it. I mean, I think it is an interesting question of like, how do we try to make sure we can meld all these different expertise together as the field has evolved and it just becomes an intersection of different pieces. And I think luckily with a lot of the schools in these areas, they are also adapting in those ways as far as what's the nature of kind of what the students are getting trained in or people that are coming from other companies. They've all been morphing. So I think luckily it all kind of has started to adapt together. I think one of the critical problems is just there's been such an injection of resourcing and interest in this field, and then the population of Massachusetts hasn't suddenly changed to go with it, and so you have this glut of talent where we need to probably find, I think, at least better ways to draw it in from other regions that would want to come here too, and being prepared to deal with having situations where someone hasn't been in the kind of role that you want, but they've been adjacent to it. And how do you help kind of train and adapt them towards that? And that kind of adaptability will help, because there's definitely people that are very good at the various things we all want to do, but there's like 10 of them and 100 of them are needed. And so for adapting to that, you need to think kind of probably geographically more diverse, but also role-wise, what are things that are adjacent that can be adapted to it, and how do you help them get there quickly to ultimately make up for this shortfall right now that's resulted from all the excitement and interest in the field, but again, the number of people hasn't changed as fast.
Yeah, I would add that, I'm Boston born and Boston bred, so I'm very optimistic and bullish on Boston. I think we've got great talent. We have great institutions, academic, professional, even cultural. So I would not bet against Boston. And as I look around cities, I don't think there are many other better cities. And I think Boston even stacks up better than Northern California for many reasons in terms of our geography and many of the other assets. I see it very positively. I think the notion of virtual or expanding hiring really just takes maybe some of the pressure. It's like a pressure release valve. It allows us to get the best out of Boston while not having to sacrifice to the extent that we maybe not be able to find all the talent we want all the time. So I think we really get the best of what we have here. I guess climate and cost of living may be a deterrent to some. But we still have all those assets, and for those who are deterred, we have the ability for virtual hiring to still attract that talent. So it's really hard to say what city or what other ecosystem really will surpass Boston, at least in the near to midterm.
Amy,
Yeah.
what about you? Close this out.
Totally agree with what both of you just shared. The only thing I would add is, just around the, some of that lack of expertise as the science changes is, at least we're seeing a lot of institutions, maybe like Battle and others who are, continually trying to expand their programming, their curriculum to, reskill people to be able to move into whether it's, cell therapies and process development and some of these areas where there's just not enough expertise. And yet the demand is continuing to grow. So I think it's a lot about, that reskilling and really trying to, kind of retrain some of the workforce for these newer, highly expertise areas that are needed.
Well, I want to thank all of my panelists. This has been a great conversation. A lot of these topics are ones that Boston is going to grapple with, I think, for the next decade as the healthcare ecosystem evolves. Amy, Armon, Jeff, thank you again. And everybody enjoy the rest of the healthcare conference.
Thanks, Allison.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.